Hello and welcome to TRT World special coverage of the U.S. presidential elections. I'm Adijan Ayamnash.
And I am Melinda Nusafora. We are here in the American capital, Washington, D.C., coming to you live. It's great to have your company.
You know, Melinda, without a doubt, 2024 has been one of the busiest election years in history. Roughly half of the world's population has voted in either local, regional, or national elections. But without a doubt, this one here that we're about to witness on Tuesday has the world's attention.
It does, Alijan, because what happens here in the United States has such broad implications well beyond these borders. Whether we're talking global conflicts, Russia, Ukraine, in the Middle East, or we're talking economic conflicts with countries like China, the next U.S. president and their policies could very well change the trajectory of so many global issues. There
is a lot to discuss, and for that we've actually put together a panel of experts to help us interpret, dissect these all-important elections. Starting off the group is Mr. Thomas Warrick. He is the director of the Future of the Department of Homeland Security Project over at the Atlantic Council. Welcome.
And next we have Todd Belt, a professor and a director of the Political Management Program at George Washington University. Thanks for being here, Todd.
Thanks for having me.
And rounding off the group of fine gentlemen is Marcus Mason. He's a senior partner over at the Madison Group, which is a bipartisan government relations firm. Welcome to all of you. Marcus, since I introduced you last, let me begin with you. For all of us that are Washington outsiders, that live and reside outside the belts, tell us what the last 500 days has been like, because that's essentially when this campaign began.
Well, the last 500 days, and really, I think what you mean is the last 100 days. This campaign has been active now for just over 3 months. It has raised more than $1 billion, which has shattered every fundraising record in the history of American politics. And it has generated more enthusiasm and larger crowds than any recent campaign, maybe with the exception of former President Barack Obama. But the one thing that this campaign has really done and has really mastered, it's been very disciplined, but it's also brought joy and optimism back into our American political discourse.
That's interesting. I think I'm going to pick up on that as we begin our discussions, because I think for a lot of journalists it appears to be a very divisive campaign. So we might circle back to that point you made later in the discussion. But we're going to go individual questions to our experts before we open up a general discussion. So Todd, let me come to you. How would you compare and contrast the leadership styles of our two candidates, and what do you make of their ability as a global leader?
Right, well, this is what's really interesting, because we all know Donald Trump, right? Ever since he came down that escalator in 2016 and announced his candidacy, he's been on the national stage as a political figure. And of course, he was on the national stage as an entertainment figure and as a media darling of the Wall Street crowd and the investment crowd and real estate. But of course, his type of leadership is very what we call transactional in academic terms. He's in it for himself, and he wants the United States to be able to get a good deal, as he likes to say, in any sort of interaction. And he has particularly pointed out different interactions between the United States and different countries where he thinks the United States is not getting its fair shake. And that's quite different than most usual approaches to foreign policy and international leadership, where the United States takes sort of a long-term look at U.S. international leadership and maintaining our alliances and, pursuing our goals multilaterally, which is very different. Kamala Harris is the new person on the block in terms of international leadership. She is relatively unknown, both in terms of her domestic leadership, but particularly her international leadership. And she has talked about maintaining our alliances and providing the most lethal force in the world. But beyond that, we don't have too much of an idea. She does have Mr. Gordon is her advisor on national security, but she hasn't really laid out a real sort of grand strategy for what she believes in.
I want to bring in Thomas into the conversation. Listening to Todd, so he was good in sort of making a distinction between the two candidates. But when you look at the American electorate, at a time when the world is going through tumultuous times and is in a conflict, do Americans really care about whether they're voting for Republicans or Democrats? Is there a distinction?
Oh, yes. No, as Mark said, this is an election in which the sides are very sharply in contrast. But it has to be said that, like most U.S. presidential elections, this is going to be decided by domestic issues. Americans have said that the economy is their most important issue. A number of people are doing well in the last 4 years, but a number are also not doing as well. Immigration and border security is the second most important issue to American voters. And here's where the contrast could not be more striking. Vice President Harris is promising to pass a bipartisan border security bill that Trump blocked in January, and is committed to bringing Republicans into her cabinet, whereas Trump is promising mass deportations, which many of us wonder how you're going to do that, but that's what he's promised, and his voters would expect him to carry that out if he's elected president.
But I think for the electorate, yes, the economy is very important. Immigration is obviously a very important issue. But for the purposes of our international global audience, I think obviously various conflicts around the world could come into play. And as we speak, Israel's war on Gaza continues. Do you feel that each particular candidate will have a different approach to what's going on in Gaza right now?
Oh, well, definitely in that case. One of the striking things about Vice President Harris, she has said that she supports Israel's right to defend itself, but that how Israel does that is important. She promised yesterday that she will work to end the war in Gaza. A number of us have an idea of what she is actually contemplating, which would be stronger U.S. leadership to bring the war to an end. At the same time, former President Trump has said he expects the war to be ended before he's inaugurated as president, and yet no one has any idea how he would actually bring that into effect. Similarly, on Ukraine, Trump wants to see the war ended in a day, never being clear exactly how that would happen, whereas Vice President Harris promises to continue support for Ukraine in trying to resist Russian aggression, and we would look for a continuation of the policies of the Biden administration, at least as far as Ukraine would be concerned.
Mm-hmm. Let's open it up to the rest of our experts on the group. Is there anything you want to hark back on to what Thomas has said? And I'm curious, for both of you, what specific policies, what sort of global outlook or tact each of these candidates might take with regards to Israel, Gaza? What can the world expect from either of them?
Well, I'm gonna double down and just clarify a little bit what Thomas has said. Vice President Harris will take a moral-driven approach to resolving the issues with Israel and Gaza. You know, she has been very clear about what is morally right and what is morally wrong about that particular conflict. I think what former President Trump does is he makes bold, brash statements, bold, broad statements, almost as if he's throwing a piece of spaghetti against the wall and expecting it to stick. That's not the way that the international community, that's not the way that the world wants a U.S. president to govern. They want to know that that president has a compass of some sort that drives them, that drives their decision-making process, and that it's not just taking a wet noodle and tossing it against the wall and saying, "See, it sticks, it sticks." No, but that's the type of approach that President Trump would bring. Note his statement: "It'll be resolved in one day before I even take office." And I hate that I automatically went to the imitation, the mimic of his voice, and I'm sorry for that. But those are the types of statements that he makes, as opposed to the deliberate approaches and deliberate statements that the vice president makes. And she's even said that, you know, one of her weaknesses may be that she thinks about things a bit too much, but thought is exactly what we need to solve these complex global issues that plague our world.
Todd, if you were, who's closer in terms of a ceasefire or potential peace talks? Marcus was saying, all right, one is wet spaghetti on the wall, one is more of a moral, ethical approach. Who's closer?
Well, I think it has to be Harris, because when you think about what Donald Trump has said about the area, it wouldn't happen if I was president, and he has given absolutely no indication of what he would do other than saying that it would be over before he takes it. That's not a plan, and that's not the sort of interaction that you would expect. You would think that Vice President Harris would continue some of the work that had been done by the Biden administration in terms of bringing in the regional actors, such as Qatar and Egypt, and trying to broker the ceasefire that way, and focusing on two things: on stopping a wider conflict from occurring, and also thinking about what happens on the day after, as they call it, the rebuilding of Gaza, and trying to get regional actors to take ownership over that, so it's not just the U.S. coming in and injecting itself and trying to push its agenda on the area.
So let me come at this from the other side then, by way of balance. What about the argument that Israel has almost made a mockery of the Democrats' policies during this conflict with regards to allegations that they're jeopardizing the peace process at every turn? If there was a strongman president like Donald Trump, would Israel be more likely to listen?
So you could make the argument that Israel has not listened to the Biden administration when it calls for ceasefires, but I actually think the explanation is a little bit different. The Israeli government, not just Prime Minister Netanyahu, the Israeli government considers itself under existential threat from Hamas and Hezbollah. And when the survival of the country is at stake, there is no country on earth that will listen to what even its closest allies tell it to do if it believes that its very survival is at risk. So in that case, no Israeli government, Netanyahu or anyone else, would listen to an American president. On the margins, where it's an issue like humanitarian aid, then the United States has succeeded in pressuring the Israeli government on humanitarian aid. The real question that concerns me and other former officials who follow Middle East issues actually isn't Gaza, it's the West Bank, where there are ministers in the Israeli cabinet who would like to see Israeli sovereignty extended to the West Bank, and there's a good possibility that President Trump would simply not bother to try to stop that. Whereas I can assure you that if Harris is president, she will throw her administration bodily in front of that and prevent that from happening, because she knows what the stakes for that would be to the entire region and to U.S. security and that of our allies. So look for the West Bank to be a flashpoint. Look for efforts to be made by either candidate to try to end the war in Gaza, but it's really going to be down to Israel and Hamas. Everyone else merely sits on the sidelines.
I think Thomas raises an interesting point, if I could follow up on
Please
that.
do.
Sure. In terms of how both candidates see how other nations work. I mean, you have Netanyahu, who is really in a fragile coalition with the far right of his parliament and his Knesset, and he has to hold that together. And I think that Harris would understand and be able to work some, diplomacy, understanding the pressures that are facing him domestically, also from the families of the hostages. He has a lot of pressure on him from them as well. Whereas you have somebody like Donald Trump who just thinks, as long as you make a deal with the leader, it gets done, as if everywhere around the world is governed by a strongman.
I mean, it's ministers like Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir who are going to be sort of a driving force in terms of what Thomas Warrick was saying. But if we sort of widen the belt a little more and get some of the U.S.'s traditional allies in the region involved, and in terms of the policy, what happens with Egypt? What happens with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Qatar? Any difference between the two candidates?
Well, quite a bit. I mean, when the Trump administration implemented what some called a Muslim ban in 2017, that was not an accurate description, but that's what everybody called it. Many of us noticed that every country with the Trump hotel was exempted from the list. What this really points to is the transactional nature of Trump's approach to the world, and I think that's what we're likely to see. Both Trump and President Biden's advisors very much wanted the grand bargain with Saudi Arabia. Everyone in Congress realizes that is only possible if a Democrat is in the White House because of reasons of U.S. politics. And so that would very much be eventually on the agenda. But for Harris, and I think also for Trump, both of them, ironically, in Todd is right, very different ways, are going to want to try to see some kind of end to the war in Gaza.
Marcus, anything you'd like to add on that?
You know, I think one clearly understands the nuance of and the subtleties of each particular interaction of each particular government. Whereas, as Thomas said earlier, you know, the other thinks that the world works in a very cookie-cutter fashion, and that if a strong man says it, then everyone else must do it because everyone else has that same mentality. I would ask our global audience to go back and look at the vice president's prosecution of transnational cartels when she was Attorney General, and look at the very deliberate process that she put in place and the very deliberate steps she took both before, during, and after to ensure that those transnational organizations were dealt with appropriately under the law, but also that the families who were impacted by those transnational organizations also felt safe, and were also taken care of in the process, and that the borders of the state of California were protected in such a way that once that action was taken, it was sure that the repercussions that would follow were properly contained.
Linda, I think it's time to actually introduce our fourth panelist. Kurt, thanks for joining us. Kurt Volker is a distinguished fellow over at the Center for European Policy Analysis. He's also former ambassador to NATO. Good to have you here on our special coverage. That being said, because Kurt actually has a background with NATO, maybe we should transition over into Russia-Ukraine.
Yeah, I think it's a good time to turn our U.S. involvement in global conflicts on to another continent. So let's discuss Russia-Ukraine. So it's a war that obviously has been raging much longer than the current Israel-Gaza conflict. It's fast approaching its third year. U.S. Congress has passed 5 bills appropriating $175 billion US dollars to Ukraine's defense and war effort since February 2022. So perhaps I'll throw this to you first of all, Kurt. How much of an impact do you think this election is going to have on the US's possible continued support for Ukraine? And could it have an impact on a potential ceasefire?
Well, I think first off, U.S. support for Ukraine is likely to continue, whether it's a Harris or a Trump administration. When President Trump was president the first time, he was the one who lifted the arms embargo on Ukraine, provided the first lethal defensive arms. And as you would know, and as your viewers would know, the war has been going on there over 10 years. It was Russia that invaded Ukraine in 2014 and seized Crimea. Still not recognized by the U.S. or Turkey or others as part of Russia. What I think you will see some differences, though. You'll see an emphasis from former President Trump, if he's elected, to want to engage Putin, will want to reach out and call him, he has said that, and tell him to stop the war, and presumably to threaten some kind of consequences if the war doesn't end. So I think you'll see a lot more pressure on that point. With with Vice President Harris, I think you're going to see a lot of continuity with the Biden administration, which has been, as you mentioned, a great deal of support for Ukraine, both military as well as financial and economic. It has been done as aid or U.S. assistance. I think former President Trump would be more likely to convert that to loans, so going forward to let Ukraine borrow money rather than to give them aid money. And I think what we don't know, there have been a lot of restrictions and a lot of conditions placed on U.S. assistance to Ukraine under the Biden administration. We don't know whether that is something that Vice President Harris would continue. with continuity, so fear of escalation, or whether she would begin easing those. And likewise with former President Trump, we don't know where he would go with that either. I think he's someone who always seems to be thinking about what kind of leverage he can provide in order to force an outcome.
Todd, let me ask you, I mean, Kurt was saying, yes, the U.S.'s support for Ukraine is likely to continue, but that's at an executive level. This is a presidential election, but it's also a congressional election. What if there's a split between the executive and the legislature? What if there's a split Congress as well? I mean, how does that come into play?
Oh, John, you completely anticipated my comment, my next comment.
He's good like that.
Yes, the purse strings in the United States are controlled by the Congress, and it looks like whoever takes Congress, it looks like we might get a flip of the House and the Senate, or whoever is president probably going to have a Republican Senate no matter what. And whether you have a Republican House or a Democratic House, it's going to be very, very close. And of course, we have that filibuster rule in our Senate where you need 60 votes to move a piece of legislation through, which means it's going to be really difficult to move any more financial and weapons through the Congress to be able to do this. I mean, there are other means of support. Of course, you can leverage allies, you can find other aspects of energy, which the Biden administration has done. You can convince allies to give their planes to Ukraine and supplement them as well. You could even get back to like a lend-lease deal. I think the ambassador was sort of hedging at where you could, put loans together. I think that's probably more likely because in the Congress right now, there's not a lot of appetite for cutting more checks that go abroad and not to help the U.S. people.
Okay, so we've covered Russia, Ukraine briefly, gone into Israel, Gaza. We cannot sort of neglect to actually look at what's happening in China. We've been talking about this ever since the NATO summit that was held here earlier on in the year. When you look at sort of China's expanding influence in the Asia-Pacific region, how are the two candidates going to approach this, both from a possible Taiwan perspective, but also the South China Sea? Because I think we all can agree that the leaders in Beijing are watching this election very closely.
So it's certainly the case that the Trump administration regarded China as the United States' primary rival. And Harris, as vice president, signed on to a national security strategy that called China the pacing threat. Both leaders are likely to try to cooperate with China where that could be done, but confront China, but in somewhat different ways. The wild card here is Trump's intention to impose tariffs, which is a tax on the value of imports coming from China. China is well tied into the international economy, and so this could have a major disruptive effect. But here's the way to think of China in the world. China imports more than 10 million barrels of oil a day. It's the thirstiest country on the planet. China sees, for example, Iran and Saudi Arabia as petrol stations, and it does not want its petrol stations firing missiles at each other. China has an enormous interest in stability and is very concerned that its entire economy would have grave trouble if there's war in the Middle East. And so China has been restrained there. On Taiwan, however, that's another story. And based on what everybody assumes, there's an increased likelihood China could try to make a military move against Taiwan. No one could possibly guess what Trump would do. And that actually, I'm sure, is his conscious thought that that's what he wants. Whereas the Biden administration took away ambiguity and said we would defend China, Harris has not had to commit to that. But that's what it's going to come down to. Will the United States go to Taiwan's defense if there is actual invasion?
I saw you nodding along there, Marcus. Do you want to add? What would you like to add?
I don't disagree with anything he said. I mean, I think I would only mimic or parrot him.
Any of our other guests?
If
Please.
I could chime in on this. I'm one of the co-directors of the GW Politics poll, and one of the questions that we asked our sample recently was, do you consider China to be more of a threat or more of an opportunity? And 2/3 of Americans said China is more of a threat than an opportunity. And guess what? Unlike just about every other policy in the United States, this did not break down on partisan lines. It wasn't
But
one
probably
party
20 years ago, it was completely different. It was, they were seeing it as an opportunity.
Certainly, certainly. And so right now, there is no incentive from an electoral standpoint or from a public opinion standpoint to stop being hard on China, especially when it comes to economic issues.
I think there's one other issue I'd bring up in relation to this, which is we are seeing an increasing alignment between Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. And it's playing out in Russia's war against Ukraine. It's playing out in the Middle East. And I think that one of the things the next president is going to have to do, whether it's Trump or Harris, is figure out if there's a way to break that up. They don't actually share the same interests. They're working together opportunistically. And can we adopt policies that will help them see that they actually are hurting each other and break up that kind of axis?
Breaking up that axis, but how does each candidate deal with sort of a multipolar world then? I mean, that's definitely something that's not only on the horizon, but in our immediate future.
So one of the things that I think is going to drive this dynamic is Trump's desire to reestablish the maximum pressure sanctions against Iran. And that actually meant pressuring China not to import Iranian oil. The Biden administration stopped focusing so much on that and focused on other issues in the China-U.S. relationship. But this is definitely going to come back and be either a disruptive force or a point of leverage as Trump tries to go after more pressure on the rulers in Tehran.
We've got about 20 minutes left of our discussion. I want to ask one more question on China, then we're going to move to immigration and chat to our audience. So let me move on promptly. We're talking about tariffs. We've mentioned the trade tariffs that Trump is proposing. Can't forget that President Biden has slapped hefty tariffs on electric cars. So if we imagine that the Chinese leadership are watching this election closely, would anyone like to put themselves in the leadership's shoes? Who would they prefer to be dealing with in the White House come January?
You want to hear Kurt's view?
Come on, Kurt.
I know what Kurt thinks on this. I want to hear it too.
I'll give you an example about Russia, because I just read a tweet that Dmitry Medvedev, the former president of Russia, put out yesterday, in which he was being very aggressive and saying it doesn't matter who wins in the U.S. is going to continue the same hostile policy toward Russia. And in some cases, I think, you know, this is what I was saying earlier, they differ as well, too. Trump will reinstate a maximum pressure policy on Iran. It'll probably be the #1 priority of getting that relationship back in order, because he sees that as the key to winding down the war in the Middle East. So that will be where he'll start. So Iran doesn't want that. Iran is going to therefore be much more inclined to want Vice President Harris. China, on the other hand, they are more certain that Trump is going to apply big sanctions on China than they are certain about Harris. Harris might do it too, and she's indicated a little bit of that kind of pressure, but they're sure about Trump. So they would probably prefer Harris. But then Russia, it's not entirely clear. I think, as I said earlier, Trump introduces a lot of uncertainty. Like what is actually going to happen here? And I think Putin is very comfortable with the certainty that we've had under the Biden-Harris administration of, okay, it's support for Ukraine, but it is measured. They're avoiding escalation. They, you know, we can threaten nuclear weapons, and you know they'll back off a little bit. He likes that. I think uncertainty from Trump is a real big question mark for him. So I think he is probably genuinely thinking, as Medvedev said, we really don't care. We don't want either one.
And just to let me just piggyback on that, and to just go more directly, if I were sitting in the shoes of the Chinese leadership, I would probably want a former President Trump to come back to the White House than I would a Vice President Harris, and for this reason. The former president, again, it's his style to make big, grandiose statements rooted in nothing but fact, but he also never has the personnel and staff, rarely has the personnel and staff in place in government to carry out some of these things. The reason why I say China would rather have him is because right now they're also paying attention not just to the threats of big tariffs, but they're also paying attention to these battles that they're losing on the technology front. You know, you've had bans and lawsuits against ZTE and Huawei in a number of different countries around the world. You've had telephone operators and wireless operators looking to push out their technologies out of the smart parts of their network because they fear surveillance. So that's one thing, that's one reason why I think the Biden-Harris administration is doing that now. They're engaging in these sort of, I don't want to call them fights, but they're engaging in these activities now. Even as we speak, they're talking to various countries about removing and banning ZTE and Huawei. I think President Trump wouldn't pay attention to that, and then that would allow them to creep back in, whether it be in Africa or South America or any place else where these engagements are going on, where they're being pushed out and their surveillance ability is being taken away.
You know, for our little discussion amongst ourselves, it serves the purpose, you know, talking about Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, China. But at the beginning of our conversation, Thomas was saying, you know, from a domestic, none of this really matters. It's all about the economy. And I think it was back in the early 90s where James Carville said, it's all about the economy, stupid. And immigration. Very briefly, before we go to our audience, in terms of the economy, the average American, Todd, let's start off with you.
In terms of the economy, what is the average American thinking? Is that the question? I mean, look, there's four indicators we usually use to predict, four economic indicators we usually use to predict election outcomes. They are GDP growth, which has been pretty good. They are unemployment, which has also been pretty good. They are consumer confidence, which just last week was very good. And inflation, which is down to about 2.1, but that's not the problem. The problem is people remember prices being very, very high. We had a period of inflation. Granted, it was better than the other countries, but that's not what people care about. They care about what's in their own wallets.
It's pretty much the same situation back in 2020.
Yeah.
But Trump lost that. So
yeah. So I mean, it's all about what you can afford. And the number one things that people are telling us that they're really concerned about are housing prices and grocery prices. And the messages that the candidates have on those issues really haven't broken through all the mess of everything else that's going on in this campaign.
I wonder also another big domestic issue is immigration. This has become such a key issue, but also I note that by June 2024, Customs and Border Protection data showed that illegal crossings were at a 3-year low.
Right.
So why is this an election issue? Does it really affect people's lives, or is this a political tool?
So this issue has been used very effectively by President Trump to drive up fear and apprehension among Americans that somehow the society is being negatively affected by people coming in illegally. This is one where the contrast really could not be starker. Whereas Trump is planning the deportation of hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people, he will, take people who are here illegally, revoke their status, and then order them to leave, and then deport them if they don't. And you could end up with camps of people separating children from their parents if the children are U.S. citizens, but the parents are not. One of Trump's advisors said yesterday, well, they can all leave. So kicking American citizens out of the country is not going to be popular. It would be very divisive. Harris, on the other hand, has been very clear she wants bipartisanship. And although some Republicans don't like this, one of the reasons is precisely because there is the realistic understanding among Harris and her team that this actually is the way to make this a less toxic problem and to actually tackle it. So the contrast here is truly night and day.
Kurt, we have to ask you about this. I mean, in terms of immigration?
Well, it's a lot like inflation. So inflation is now 2.1%, but that's after a couple of years of 8%. And so everything that people are buying now is 20% higher than it was 4 years ago. And everybody can feel that. Same thing, the numbers of illegal immigrants coming into the country now is vastly lower than it was 2 years ago, 3 years ago. But 2 years ago, 3 years ago, it was out of control. And now you have an additional 10 to 12 million people in this country illegally that are putting a lot of pressure on low-wage jobs, on inner cities, on crime, on fentanyl and drug overdoses. And as our colleague here said, President Trump has been very effective at using that to say the things that they're seeing that they're unhappy about is because of illegal immigration that took place under Biden and Harris.
No,
even when that's the way it looks.
But even when in fact much of that isn't actually true. I mean, the eating of dogs and cats was just a bizarre story, totally unfounded. And you can go through other aspects of the narrative that are equally incorrect. Statistics show that migrants, legal or otherwise, are less likely to commit crimes than people who were born in the United States. But most people don't even know that those are, in fact, the facts. So this really is a political issue, and we'll see what the voters want to choose from, because the menu of policy options could not be more different.
And it's an issue that's being supercharged. It's an issue that's being supercharged by the elections, but also by outside actors. I was just in New York, and I'm watching a candidate defend herself against immigration, to talk about what she would do for immigration. Now, why would a candidate in New York talk about immigration from the southern border at Mexico? Because no one wants to talk about the fact that there is a governor in a state in this country who is very effective at moving these immigrants from his state, either by plane, bus, or train, to places like New York, Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts, or different places like that. So all of a sudden, when you get 300, 400, 500, or 1,000 people showing up on your doorstep that you did not plan for, with no resources and any way to address them, yes, it becomes a political hot potato. It becomes something, and people should not be treated that way, and that's why I truly believe Vice President Harris's approach will be one that will be rooted in morality, rooted in ethics, in the same way that she prosecuted those transnational organizations that engaged in human trafficking. It would be that same focus that would be taken here.
You know, we can continue this conversation for many more hours.
I feel like we could do another whole hour special, but let's throw it over to our audience.
We are excited to actually open the floor to members of our audience. It's an opportunity for you to direct specific questions to our panelists and really get the answers that you're looking for. I'd like to start off with Alperen Açıkol. Okay. Anybody have a question there? Please stand up and you can ask your question.
Should I just stand up? Oh.
Yeah.
I have a question regarding this moral approach to Gaza conflict. Actually,
if you could just have a nice large voice. Sorry, it's a little bit hard to hear on this end.
Okay, the question is about the Gaza conflict and the moral approach that the Vice President Harris actually talked about. How convincing that was for the Muslim Americans that's so concerned about their tax dollars actually going to Gaza as bombs? And do you think how detrimental it will for the election actually to convince those voters?
I think this is the first time in a while where the small Muslim electorate actually is going to have, or what they've been saying is making headlines. Thomas, maybe you want to take a crack at this?
Yes, well, so certainly in the battleground state of Michigan, there is a larger number of Arab American Muslim, Palestinian American voters, some of whom are Muslims, some of whom are Christians. And so that demographic has taken a great interest in the positions of both candidates. It's actually a toss-up as to how that plays off against other people in the state of Michigan. But the state is likely to be decided by a very small number of people. The problem is that much of what Trump has been saying on this subject has not been the answers that Arab Americans in Michigan, for the most part, want to hear. And so, ironically, what you tend to see is Arab American voters tend to vote exactly the same way other Americans do, and they are divided.
Yeah, I think the issue is whether Muslim voters turn out to vote for Harris. The Democratic Party does have a division of those who are much more sympathetic to the Palestinians, those who are more sympathetic to Israel, and there's a risk that they just won't turn out, the Muslim voters. I don't think there's much chance they're going to vote for Trump, but if they don't come out in the numbers needed to vote Democrat, that's going to harm Harris's chances in a place like Michigan.
I'm interested in asking this. I mean, you talked about sort of Muslim voters coming out to vote, but outside of the United States, most people will actually take a closer look at national polls. Former President Trump is polling at 47%. Vice President Kamala Harris is polling at 48%. But for me, I think it's not really an important metric that you should be looking at. When you have less than 60% of the electorate going out to the ballot boxes to vote, is it the more important thing to look at is how each party or each candidate can actually sort of motivate their base to that's what's going to determine this, right?
And energy and turnout. Yeah.
There's three things you try to do in an election. You try to get your base out, you try to make sure the other base is demoralized and doesn't turn out, and then you try to persuade those very, very few people who are left in the middle who are still undecided, and that number is getting smaller and smaller. And the question is, in a state like Michigan, where this may be very important, look, our 2016 was decided by 77,700 votes across 3 states. And in 2020, when Biden won by close to 7 million votes, much more than the 3 million Hillary Clinton won by, it was even less, 43,000 votes across 3 states. So these very, very small margins in the states may be very important. Will they show up? That's a very good question. People are wondering, will some of these people in Michigan vote for Jill Stein? Sometimes it's intriguing to say, well, if this third-party candidate is taking votes away, does that necessarily make them a spoiler? But you don't know if those people would have showed up at all if that third-party option wasn't available to them. But we're going to have a really close election, and these margins can be very important.
Yeah. Talking about mobilizing people to come out and vote, I love that we have a high school student joining us in our audience here, an example of young people wanting to be involved. Emre Ulukaya, I believe. What question do you have for our panel? Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. My question is that which state do you think is the most important for candidates to win in terms of winning the elections?
Thank you. All right, Todd, straight away. Thank you, Emre.
Pennsylvania.
All right,
it looks
tell us
like
why.
The road to the White House runs through Pennsylvania.
So 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue goes through Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania, yeah. I mean, if you look, I mean, obviously we use the Electoral College in the United States, and that means that a few states are the ones that could break either way for either candidate. We have 7 of them this time. We have Nevada, which looks like it's going for Harris, but it's not really a critical state. Arizona looks like it's going for Trump. Georgia looks like it's going for Trump. North Carolina was in play, and the Democrats thought that they had a real strong chance there, especially given the issues with the Republican gubernatorial candidate there. But the Harris campaign just pulled all of its advertisement out of North Carolina. But they did.
But that was the only state that actually President Trump had won out of the 7 battleground in the previous election.
That's right, and he's campaigning really hard to maintain it. It's hard to see how he gets to 270 without that state. But the Harris campaign forced him to expend resources in that state, which was pretty strategic. Wisconsin looks like it's going for Harris. Michigan is looking like it's going for Harris, but that big prize of 19 electoral votes, it's hard to see how either candidate gets to 270 without taking it.
So I want to ask you then, Marcus, if Pennsylvania is the state that we're all looking at, to Emre's question, you've been part of campaigns before. How do you generate support and energy in a state like Pennsylvania during these sorts of election campaigns?
So, and thank you for that question. Look, I think there are a couple of things that aren't really being accounted for here in this particular election. Everyone is focused in on polling numbers and looking at polls that come out day in and day out. Polls are snapshots in time. So every time you look at a poll, you're always looking at the past. Even if it's the final poll, you're looking 3 to 4 days into the past when you're looking at that poll. What you're not accounting for, and what that poll can't account for because it is the past, is the momentum on the ground that's moving forward, is that swell that's moving forward. President Biden, when he announced his re-election, built what I would consider the most formidable turnout machine in the history of turnout machines, and even exceeds President Barack Obama's Organizing for America turnout machine. In Vice President Harris, what you have is a candidate who can put the energy, who literally put energy into that machine, and has people out at every office in every state, in every key battleground state, in every county, on the ground knocking doors. They knocked 1 million doors in the state of Pennsylvania yesterday. That should tell you something. When you have an organization that can knock 1 million doors in a state, that's also the commitment that they have to that state in winning that state. The other thing that's not being accounted for in this election is the first-time voter. It is impossible to poll a first-time voter like yourself. And so what I saw anecdotally when I went to my polling place was I saw mothers bringing their voting age daughters in to vote with them. The mother stood in line, the daughter stood in line right behind them. They were voting. That was an intentional plan. We always say, plan your vote. They clearly planned their vote. What the other thing that I also saw was mothers bringing their underage daughters, their non-voting age daughters in to vote with them, to show them the importance of the process and that their vote does count, so that in years to come, it becomes muscle memory for them to go back to the polls. The other thing that I have noticed is, and this has been about my particular demographic, black men. People have said that black men will turn out and vote for Donald Trump. That's a false. That's false. They are underestimating the power of the black mother, grandmother, and aunt on their sons, nephews, and grandsons, and they are also miscasting the fight. It's not a question as to whether or not they will come out and vote for Donald Trump. Is it the couch or Harris? Will they stay home and sit on the couch and play video games, or can they be turned out and to vote for Kamala Harris? I spoke to a former neighbor from my hometown in California, and she said, Marcus, I took my son and 5 of his friends to the polls to vote. Now, that can't be quantified, that can't be found on any poll. That's in that energy that comes from a turnout machine that is designed to get people to the polls.
Kurt, I mean, Marcus was mentioning momentum, energy. When you look at sort of the last 100 days, this is one of the time frames we were looking at. What a volatile last 100 days it's been. Let's not forget we have a current president that has dropped out of the race. We have a current candidate who has been shot at, and after that point we said there's no way that Donald Trump could actually lose this election. At least that's what I was saying to my colleagues back in Istanbul. But right now, at the end of the day, a couple hours before polls open, it's still neck and neck.
Sure. Let me comment on that and also on the momentum issues. First, in terms of this race, it has been fascinating, as you said. When President Biden was still in the race, he was trailing former President Trump by a lot, and it was consistent, and everybody could see it. And that was during the time when President Trump was shot at the first time. And then, when Vice President Harris took over, she very quickly evened out the race. Now, as you said, she put a lot of energy back into the Democratic campaign, saying, okay, now there's somebody we actually think is there, and we can vote for her. So that evened it out. That lasted maybe 3 weeks to a month. And she was deliberately riding the wave and playing out the clock, you know, trying to buy time by not doing too much to offend anybody, just taking that freshness and newness. But it started to wear off. And then she's had a few stumbles, he's had a few stumbles. He had a hard time figuring out how to campaign against her. He knew how to do it against Biden, but had a harder time with her. I think he started to find his footing. And then we had this crazy incident last week where he has a big rally in Madison Square Garden and hires a comedian who makes a really bad joke that throws off the news cycle for the entire week. So it's been a wild ride of a campaign.
He made a series of really bad.
I only heard the one, but if I could just say, coming to you from Hatboro, Pennsylvania, where I grew up, and my father taught at Bucks County Community College. The trick in Pennsylvania, it's a microcosm of the country in some ways. It's red and blue. To win Pennsylvania, a Republican has to get a certain segment of the vote from Philadelphia. That's basically it. That, you know, Erie County will go one way or the other, Pittsburgh, but there's always enough red votes among the blue there that you can be okay. Philadelphia is what counts. And most Republican candidates ignore Philadelphia. Donald Trump has not. And he has made a case, as you said, he's made a case to black men, he's made a case to Latino men, that their economic interests have been harmed under the Biden administration, and that he would be better for them economically. And he's not going to win a majority of the black vote, no question he's not going to get that. But if he can pick up 15%, 18%, that could be enough to add those votes to what he's otherwise going to get in the center of the state.
I'm curious also as to what impact do you think the celebrity endorsement has on a campaign? We had Taylor Swift and the cat ladies. We've got Lady Gaga, I think, this afternoon on the rocky steps for Kamala Harris. Are the big celebrities coming out endorsing Donald Trump? You had a bit of a smile, Todd. What do you think? I'm curious. Does it get people out to vote?
Well, the question is, does it get people out to vote is different than does it really affect their vote, right? And in terms of the new voter registrations that you were probably insinuating here about a lot of new voters coming into this election, after the Taylor Swift endorsement, we saw all the states, like there were 4 times as many hits on their voter registration websites as they had in the past. So we also know that when somebody registers to vote, you can count on them voting that very first time because they are really engaged and they want to do it. So there and what is the reason? There's 2 other issues here in this election other than the crime, the economy, and the immigration that we've talked about. The 2 issues that the Democrats are really pushing, which has really resonated with these celebrity endorsements, and that is abortion and the threat to democracy posed by Donald Trump. And I think that for those younger voters, we're seeing those as really 2 big issues. When you ask the younger voters, what is your #1 issue? It's still the economy. It is for everybody, right? But these issues are also very important for those young voters and for those who are coming out to vote. They may not be told who to vote for, but they are being energized by some of these.
And here's another reason why the celebrity endorsements matter. In a campaign, you have paid media, earned media, and free media. All right, and if a celebrity endorser comes out and they have a large enough following, like a LeBron James or a Beyonce or a Taylor Swift, it hits the news cycle. And it carries the news cycle for probably 48 hours. That's money that the campaign doesn't have to spend on ad time. That's money that the campaign doesn't have to spend amplifying that endorsement because it gets amplified on its own. It gets amplified for free. With social media and things going viral now, that happens for free now. And it ends up in the inboxes, in the TikToks, Instagrams, and the various social media platforms that all the young people over here are very, very adept at, that I just kind of toy with. But it reaches them in a much different way. Look, I said to a candidate recently, if you're not on TikTok, you're not anywhere. And when those things hit TikTok, you watch them, and you watch them get spun up over and over and over again. So that's one of the other reasons why they matter.
What you said, I'm not anywhere. That I don't even know.
You're here, Alexander.
Yes.
With us in Washington.
Unfortunately, we're coming to the end of our
We are.
allocated time. I'd like to thank all of our esteemed guests. Thomas, thank you very much. Todd, Marcus, and Kurt, thank you for being with us. And our audience members, thank you for joining us here. I hope that you got some answers to some of your important questions.
And of course, don't forget, this might wrap up our special coverage here for Monday, but this is only the beginning. We're ramping up again on Tuesday from 20 GMT, live out of Istanbul. And then Jafar Hasnain, our colleague, will be joining Alijan and I here from 23 GMT in Washington.
Well, thank you very much from Melinda and myself. Thank you and goodbye from Washington.